Hi, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's session on responsible innovation. I'm going to be your host for the session. My name is Furaha Asani, and my pronouns are she, her. And I'm also the research lead at Watershed. So I am joined on screen and for the entire session by two BSL interpreters, Sarah and David. Sarah's pronouns are she, her. She's a white woman in her early 40s, and she's wearing a black top. Her hair is short and red, and she's sitting in front of a white wall. David's pronouns are he, him. He's a white middle-aged man wearing an open-collared shirt. He's sitting in front of a blue background, and I'm just going to describe myself as well. So I am a Black woman of mixed heritage. I'm in my mid-30s. I have an afro that comes up just above my shoulders. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses, red lipstick, a black top, and I believe what is called a houndstooth patterned scarf. I hope I'm correct. So yes, thank you so much for joining us for this session. I just quickly want to point out that if you are active on social media, you can follow hashtag place and presence to catch up on information from some of the sessions that you've missed out on. And also after the session, we're going to be having our last session on the main stage, which is going to be looking at the future of international work in our creative cluster. So I just want to give you a little bit of background as to why we are hosting this session today. So within the Bristol and Bath Creative R&D, we have been thinking about legacy. We've been thinking about accountability and how we can be transparent in holding ourselves accountable. And so what we decided to do was a couple of months ago, we convened a working group on responsible innovation in the tech sector. So myself and all of the panelists today, we form part of this working group. We're thinking about, as you would have heard earlier in one of our sessions, how to embed inclusion in every aspect of our work, from conceptualization to prototyping. And we really want to capture every part of the process so that we can publish and we can disseminate it. So going back to that transparency. So in thinking about that now, I would like to welcome to the stage three other members of this working group to just quickly introduce themselves before we have our conversation. So welcome everyone. Can I start quickly with Sam, and then we'll go to Alex, and then we'll go to Will.
Thank you. So I'm Sam. I'm a cisgender white female with long red hair, which is currently parted in a long braid on one side. I go by she, her, and I am Canadian. My background is a half blank white wall and what I call an obligatory Look, I Read bookshelf, which includes a Purble, which is a responsible robot toy for children that I am actually currently testing out for their manufacturers.
Thank you so much, Sam. Alex, over to you.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm Alex, and I'm a cisgendered 53-year-old white woman with normally very unruly curly hair, but that is tightly held back today by a hair clip due to the fact that my hairdresser has a 6-month backlog due to the lockdown. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm actually wearing matching lilac lipstick and the jumper, and I'm sporting, as very often, my kind of most beloved octopus brooch, because everybody needs an octopus brooch.
Nice. Thank you, Alex. Over to you, Will.
I'm Will. I'm a white cisgendered male in my early 30s. I have a shaved brown hair, shaved brown hair and a beard. I'm wearing headphones today, and I'm wearing a delightful leopard print shirt with a pink background. I'm streaming to you from my living room.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to have you here, especially because we've actually been having these conversations many times via email, actually, and sometimes through a Zoom room. So it's great to kind of open up our conversation to not just our own creative cluster, but we hope audience further afield and colleagues, so that everyone can kind of be caught up on our thinking, because I know that in all of our meetings, we always talk about how we want to admit that we do not know everything. So we are trying as much as possible to think about accountability, like I said, interrogate what accountability means in our sector, what it means to us as people, think about who, gets left out of certain decisions, think about inclusion, just so many questions. And again, we don't have all the answers, but we do the best that we can. So with that being said, I would love to give you all a chance to talk about things that you're passionate about within our creative cluster, and perhaps, kind of knowledge and expertise that you're bringing from your past experiences, or, alongside what's going on in the cluster in your careers. So again, if I can hand over to Sam.
So glad to be the first to speak.
No pressure, Sam.
No pressure. Yeah, I think similar to so many people who have spoken today, I've really spent a lot of my career moving between spaces, from public services like childhood education and higher education, creative industries like music and publishing, commercial enterprises like financial technology, and nonprofit and advocacy with human rights organizations like Amnesty International, business and human rights groups. And what I'm really interested in understanding across all of this is the structures and practices that exist in these different spaces, and how decision makers and practitioners can create things and how they adapt to change. And I'm passionate about bridging between those spaces and starting to merge and meld those types of structures, those practices, norms, and knowledge. And all of that really came together for me when I began working at Everyone, which was a think tank based in London focused on making responsible technology the new normal. And it was while I was leading the program on responsible innovation at Everyone that I created a responsible innovation practice or methodology called consequence scanning, which will probably come up once or twice throughout the rest of this panel, which is a dedicated time and hierarchical process to help teams explore the potential consequences of their business and product decisions. And this is where Alex and I met and began working directly with organizations in tech and civil society around embedding agile responsible innovation and experimenting with what that looks like on the ground, which is how we originally came to be involved with the Creative R&D cluster, and really thinking about how we could support the cluster as cross-cutting fellows in embedding and practicing responsible innovation through immersive training sessions and exercises, and then researching its long-term impact in a space-based project. So when Everyone closed last May, Alex and I formed our own community interest company called Consequential, and carrying on the work around responsible innovation within the cluster with a view to supporting the cluster in creating its own responsible innovation processes and adapting existing thinking to its own context, and really thinking about how to use responsible innovation and how it operates and it funds creative technology projects. And then within those projects, what responsibility looks like, which Alex can speak a bit more about.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to hand over to you, Alex.
Great. That was my cue, wasn't it? Yeah, fantastic. So yeah, I grew up very much in the creative industries. I spent about 25 years in the comms industry. And I was really shaped by that time, which tells you all about my age, when technology met communication. And that really started to set up the seeds for that dual fascination between messy humans, the way we tell stories, the power and the potential of collectiveness, and then leading pretty quickly in, okay, so what does technology bring into that, and how do we translate our responsibility into the choices that we have, especially working in and with technology. I'm now a certified coach and a facilitator, and as Sam said, we met at Everyone, where I was leading the Responsible Leadership Program. And I'm always a little bored just doing one thing. So when I met Sam, I went, can I help out with what you're building? Because I think it's fascinating. I love doing that. And I think, as I say, the rest is history. Within the clusters, I was really lucky because everybody who knows me knows that I love working with people. I really enjoy working with people, and I believe knowledge comes when you listen deeply to people. So I was really, really grateful to be able to run a series of workshops, both with the producers and with the fellows, but also with the businesses, exploring what is responsible innovation, understanding, is there a journey for an organization to kind of get their heads around responsible innovation, and introducing people to different concepts and models. Sam and I always say we're both very model agnostic, but one thing we really realized early on in the clusters is how important it was to rally around the same language. And I think, you know, responsible innovation is one of those things which can be many things for many people. And articulating what it means to individuals, but also to the organizations they share, was always the first step. Sam said we then decided, wow, we're going to do this more often for more people. We're going to found a little consultancy in the pandemic. I mean, why not? Why shouldn't we found an organization in the pandemic? We did that. And I think the way that we like to talk about what we're doing is really that we support strategy and innovation for those who want to create good businesses while creating common good. And I think the way that both of us do it, because Sam also is an accredited coach, is that we believe deeply that the people who work with will find the best solutions for them. What does it mean to be responsible? All we really do is we help them make sense of where they are currently, because that's really hard to identify when you're in the middle of it. And then also get clarity on where they want to go and support them in getting there. And I think that's what both Sam and I did hands-on in the clusters, conversation by conversation.
Thank you so much, Alex. I think before I hand over to Will, I just want to point out two things that you said, is that I'm noticing a lot of people in the cluster have been talking about, you know, the way relationships have organically formed within these networks and have led to different collaborations on more than one project. And the second thing is, I like the phrase that you used, model agnostic, was it? And it's really interesting because academics love models. And we have loads of academics, loads of university partners, not just creative hubs that we're working with. And I think that this again shows how, you know, we are all coming from different angles with different, used to different ways of working. And there has to be we all have to seed some power. And I think that is part of the process of responsible innovation. It's not just about the product, because this is an R&D collaborative project at the end of the day. And it's not just about bringing fellows on board for their own R&D, it's ours as well. So I think this is just a really nice case study in that. But with that being said, I'm going to welcome Will to introduce himself and a little bit about his experiences and passions.
Thank you. So yeah, my work largely sits within research engagement and sort of using public engagement to foster an environment where we can make sure there's some accountability within research through kind of responsible research and innovation, and how we can understand within public audiences where knowledge and expertise might exist outside of that the formal kind of academic framework, and how researchers might be able to work with public groups or public interest groups around their specific research topic and think about sort of where their voice has space within that research process, and how they can also use that voice to kind of create a responsibility and an accountability within their research process. So over the years, kind of using that to develop platforms where we can we can start to understand where knowledge might exist outside of, as I've said, kind of outside of the academic or formal academic framework. And I'm particularly interested in the cluster because we're seeing kind of examples of that where it's not just research innovation being conducted solely within university settings, and there's sort of clusters of groups working from outside of the academic framework and feeding into that. And I came into the cluster from kind of two positions, and I run the communications channels, thinking about how we can sort of communicate the outputs and the research outputs to a public audience, and think about what conversations might be able to have digitally through communication. But I also kind of come from the last year of working with the University of Bristol's Computer Science Department and camera within there, and thinking sort of towards the latter end of that contract about what kind of voices are being left out of creative tech and specifically immersive technologies, and specifically within COVID, where are the opportunities that are rising with immersive technologies, but again, whose voices are being left out of that experience? And yeah, so I think that's sort of where my work fits within the cluster and within this kind of group, and that's sort of where my interest and passion lies.
Thank you so much, team. So I'm just going to dive right into it by asking if you could clarify what exactly it is that you mean by responsible innovation. And the reason I'm emphasizing you is because, again, I've come to realize, and I think this is, everyone will always say this, is that the different terminologies mean different things to different people based on our backgrounds, based on our context, circumstances. So in terms of our working group, in terms of this cluster, what do you mean by responsible innovation? And again, I'll go back to Sam.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly spot on in terms of you and Alex are saying. I think there's a lot of space for many, many definitions and understanding around responsible innovation. But when Alex and I start to wrangle with what we mean by responsible innovation, we usually come down to three things, which is being open and accountable with your intent, being aware of the potential consequences of your decisions and taking steps to address them, and being inclusive and thoughtful about your stakeholders and who you're involving in the innovation process. And I think to us, a lot of what responsible innovation comes down to is looking at these really, really huge topics like inclusion and community and equality and power, and making them real and tangible within the process of creation. And one of the reasons that we're so passionate about responsible innovation in the context of creative technologies is Alex and I kind of both believe that it's in the creative industries and it's in the arts where, you know, the most exploration and experimentation takes place around, you know, passion and wonder and delight and fun. And it's really in that experimentation that new technologies, new ways of innovating, and new business models are created, which inevitably find their way into the mainstream. And so in so many ways, the creative technology sector is really where the earliest and most exciting experimenting is happening with responsible innovation, because it's really leading the way and imagining what the future can look like. And you know, it's quite an interesting challenge to be trying to wrangle that into some really practical, tangible things on the ground.
Thank you so much, Sam. Alex, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm not going to bore you with what I think responsible innovation is, because it would be slightly weird if it was something completely different to Sam's. For me, language is one thing, and then I think that comes with being a coach. My core question always is, what would that look like?
Okay.
So my question really is, what does that look like? So when you talk about responsible innovation, what does that look like? I'm much more interested in, I don't really mind how you define it. I'm really interested if you can decide to explain to me the behaviors that sit behind that, the actions that sit behind that. How do you make decisions in a concept of responsible innovation? So you already noticed that I'm the deeply practical of the two of us who always go, so what would that look like? And it's not surprising that a lot of the work that I did with the clusters was around principles. So how are we going to behave under the guise of responsible innovation? Because again, beliefs and articulations, and I think you said that so beautifully, Furaha, are deeply contextualized, right? What you believe a word means, even if you explain it, I might still believe that manifesting that looks very differently. We could both talk about freedom. For me, a behavior of freedom might look very differently than to you a behavior of freedom might look like. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's the same thing with responsible innovation. How do we behave to be innovative in a responsible way? And Sam talked about it. What are principles? What are the practices that we need to be able to exercise those principles? And then how do we build our organizations to, again, allow to carry all of that? So that's what I'm deeply passionate about.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alex. Will, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
So very much my thinking around it very much echoes the points of Sam and Alex, and obviously because we talk about this a lot in the group. But I think often innovation can be seen as quite a linear process, or a process that builds. But I think with responsible innovation, for me, it's more of a kind of iterative process, and the kind of the responsible in front of it allows for that, the opportunity in which yes, we can iterate that process, and we don't just accept that a process that has happened is innovated by making that better. It isn't just sort of built upon to make it better. It's that we work on that process, and we allow time and space rather than kind of snowballing with innovation. Because again, as Sam sort of said, a lot of them, specifically within creative tech, there seems to be a great deal of sort of very quick advancements, and things move along very quickly. If we think about smartphones, we weren't necessarily using them so readily 10, 15 years ago. And that's all happened very quickly. Whereas in responsible innovation, I think there's the time and the space to be able to kind of stop and understand and think about those processes, and sort of slow those down a bit, or not necessarily slow the speed at which those innovations occur, but the thinking around that and the considerations that are made within that are kind of a more considered process.
Thank you so much. And I think, just to make the audience aware that in our meetings, we have been often talking about, when we are defining certain terms, who gets left out of those definitions. So as Alex said, just because this is what we define responsible innovation as, is that everyone's, definition of it? And a couple of days ago, I had a discussion with our very brilliant inclusion producer, who you may have seen earlier, Tony Bajam, and we're talking about, different experiences and our research strategy at Watershed, and kind of just bouncing ideas off of each other. And then Tony got me thinking about something. If we look at experiences and products as interventions, Tony goes, well, Furaha, the people at the other end, the consumers or the audience, how do we know that this is actually what they want? So just because we have money to do all of this innovation, which is going to lead to certain products, prototypes, experiences, is that what people actually want? So, part of this responsible innovation project of ours, I shouldn't refer to it as a project, I should say a behavior that we are trying to embed within our own practice and our praxis, not just as practitioners, not just as a community of practice, but as individuals, is thinking about everyone that we claim we're targeting with our experiences and our products. Is that what they want? Is that what they need? Have we given them a chance to communicate that to us, rather than just enforcing? So I think that this is a really good segue into the next question that I want to bring to the panel, is that we know that historically, and not just historically, actually, right now, innovation has often come at the cost of marginalization of peoples, of lands, at the cost of social injustice, and climate crisis. So what can we do as innovation, as individuals and within our cluster, to redress this, and to make sure that we do better as we move ahead? I guess we can start in the same rotation, Sam, Alex, and Will.
Yeah, thank you. And it's such a good question. I think for me, looking at the destruction of innovation is really tied up in that narrative of technological determination, and technology is inevitable and innovation is destiny. And that narrative is so often pushed by people who potentially have a very material gain to stand from that technology moving forward. And I think with the way that the creatives and people within this cluster have it in their DNA to push boundaries and to ask questions about who gets left out, or what is the impact of this, and what does this mean, and what do people actually want, and what do people actually need, is a big part of that redress in terms of challenging that narrative and showing different ways of doing things. And I've had conversations with some of the cluster's team around this hypothesis that if you're building a different culture that holds different values, can you produce different types of technologies? Can you produce different types of organizations and leaders that own and create these technologies? And does that lead to different results? So I think it's up to all of us as well as the creative sector as a whole to start to really create and embrace a different narrative and to show what different types of innovation can look like. And it's not always about simply redressing what's gone wrong in the past, but also envisioning a different type of future and a different way to get there. I think that is my high level answer around that, but so much of it comes down to that narrative and that inherent belief that innovation has to be destructive, or that there has to be innovation in the first place in the direction that feels linear and inevitable.
Thank you so much for that, Sam. Quickly, before I hand over to Alex, I'm going to say, again, something you said. This is so interesting how, I find that these type of conversations bring up things that so many different people in different groups, in different parts of the world are talking about, and how there's this very fantastic scholar that goes by the name of Janine Francois, who talks about how, and when I say talks about, this was in a conversation between her and I, and she was talking about always trying to operate from a spirit of abundance. And that makes me think about how you're talking about, or how you mentioned that we often look at innovation as something that has to be destructive. And I'm thinking, what is the opposite of that then? Operating hopefully from a spirit of abundance? I don't fully yet know for myself what shape that takes in my own life, but I definitely know that it popped up when I thought, oh, that is the opposite to the destructiveness, to that destructive force. So yeah, thank you. Moving to, did you want to add something to that, or
a little bit, because I think a little bit on almost the other end of that is Kate Raworth's donut theory around not necessarily operating within a spirit of abundance, but operating within an understanding of the limits of our planet, and what's best within that, inside of that, for many different sectors and many different people. And I think finding maybe a middle between those two different theories in which to innovate is actually really quite an interesting and incredible space to be in.
Thank you so much for that. Can I go on to Alex?
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere. So I love what Sam says, but then I wouldn't I? I love this idea. Where I used to work, there was always this idea, give me a limit, give me riverbanks, and then I'm starting to kind of shape myself within those. One thing that I'm very passionate about is the power of intent, which is kind of building on this. So if you are operating within a certain mindset, the power of being intentful is just incredible. And I think it is one of the ways to hold against this tech determinism. It is really important. What are we intending to create? Why are we innovating? And one of the insights that we had when we worked with the clusters was that introducing the word intent into collective decision making made a massive difference. And I'm still in contact with some of the businesses that we worked with, and what became very clear over a couple of weeks, because this is muscle, right? This is like building a muscle. You have to really do it again and again to understand how it works. It's deep process work. The change happens in the work. The change doesn't happen in the models. So one business reported back that they actually really introduced regular check-ins on shared intent, and that had really become part of their business practices. And the result of that new practice, but also the language that they could rally around, was to provide a much more solid and shared foundation for the businesses to talk about, what do we want to see? What are we creating towards? Then another example, and I think that was actually Paul Clark, who's one of the digital placemaking fellows. And I think what he said, he convened all of his partners and collaborators to introduce this concept of shared responsibility in innovation. And he asked each of them to share their very particular interests and intent for a prototype they're working on together. And then following that, they drafted a set of principles for the project and a project mission as a collective signal of intent. So I'm fascinated about that. And I think that definitely for me is a way to redress some of that storytelling by by a deep belief that you can become part of another story. Again, I'm coming across very coachy here. Sorry about that. What I think in practice, again, what we saw around this was also very, very often discussions around how culture helps this, because if you don't just think about how to create responsible innovation, but if you're starting to understand that really responsible businesses and responsible cultures will start to have a much better chance to start to look at innovation in a more responsible way, then you're starting to go that level deeper. And the change that is happening on a cultural level, hopefully, is a much more sustained change.
Thank you so much, Alex. Over to you, Will.
Thank you. I think mine sort of plays into and adds to what Alex was saying about practices, but actually, I think what needs maybe redressing is that we often think about we have our certain processes and our certain practices that we use to innovate specific things or areas or bring about change within a part of society, or using creative technology or to change creative technologies. But I think something that I found which is quite a strong narrative in the theme of the research that I was doing, was around the processes themselves needing to be redressed and innovated and thought about. And we had become quite comfortable in those processes and realized that as those processes were going on, things were getting left behind and gaps were starting to form, and things had been forgotten about because we had that comfort in that what we thought we were doing worked for everyone. And that specifically came about in terms of some of the conversations I was having with artists about how they were supported throughout COVID. Specifically in the very beginning of things, there were lots of cultural organizations that they had been part of a community with, who suddenly had to focus on keeping their buildings open and their staff employed or furloughed, or looking after their direct community in terms of those who were employed by them and the kind of physical assets that they had and kind of protecting that community. But they had these kind of communities of artists around those buildings that were suddenly kind of forgotten about. And I think for thinking about inclusion and thinking about kind of innovation within that, we need to kind of often check back on ourselves and remember that we can't just forget about, we know that there, for the specific example, the kind of, I think some of those organizations thought those communities were well looked after because they'd checked in on some of them, but some of them were reporting that they hadn't even been checked in at all. And there were lots of people who were kind of reporting the same stuff, and it very much felt like that was a process that needed to be redressed and kind of thought about.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Will. There's so much for us to think about. I would like to ask one more question, and then we're going to take a question or two from the audience. And that is, what excited you or excites you about the future of responsible innovation within the Clusters program? Guess we'll go with Sam, Alex, then Will again.
I think, to me, the most exciting thing that I see is people really starting to make connections between so many of the different issues around technology. So human rights, the environment, social justice, equality. They're starting to bring them together and really examine how they intersect and how addressing them can build towards similar goals or similar visions of what can be done differently. And the cluster in particular has shown a real interest in how addressing these can look in the work and what it means to create space and to explore these issues within a decision-making and within a process, and as Will says, within their communities and within their stakeholders, and looking back at what is existing today and does that in and of itself need to be innovated? Are there gaps in that are leading to outcomes or contributing to some of the problems we see? And I think that's incredibly inspiring and something that I'm starting to see more in other spaces as well, which makes me fairly optimistic, actually, that we just might be able to examine the role of business and technology in society and come to different conclusions.
Thank you so much, Sam. Alex?
Yeah, just very little to build on that, but I think I get really excited when people talk less about responsible innovation and more around responsible business, doing good business. I think what Will said, what is the opposite of responsible innovation? I think, I'm not quite sure about that, but I think one of the dangers of focusing on responsible innovation is that we don't talk about responsible maintenance. And I would love to talk about responsible maintenance, because people know that I have a big passion for maintenance. I think maintenance is just, I'm a gardener. And as a gardener, it's a very weird place, because maintenance and innovation live alongside at any given time. As a gardener, you have to think constantly in 3 time periods. You have to think about what you planted in the past, what you're planting right now, and what will grow in the future. And you can't just focus on one thing. I'm boring you. I can't talk about this. But anyway, but so this idea about what excites me is that innovation is obviously very exciting. It is very shiny. Loads of people love to talk about. But I'm starting to see more and more people talk about the part that it is just part of doing business. It's just part of doing brilliant creative work. It isn't necessarily just the innovation. It is as much the maintenance. And ultimately, it is a different way of thinking. And to that point, different points of thinking need different processes, need different practices. So let's take the energy that everybody has around the word innovation and create principles, practices, processes, and policies that do not just manage innovation, but actual proper business maintenance.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Will, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Well, Alex always does it so beautifully with such great metaphors. So I think for me, it's thinking about innovation away. Well, for me, coming into this, I think my understanding of innovation was quite basic in terms of thinking about economic growth and financial growth and just growth generally. And I think what I'm excited about in the future is a recognition and a what's the word? So is the recognition that, and specifically within the within this cluster, we're starting to look at where does innovation exist within those relationships, within those conversations, within something that doesn't necessarily have like a tangible direct output that is a commodity and is something that can be traded. It's actually whereas and I think going back to what Alex was saying about that becoming part of everything we do, and it just becomes an accepted behavior. That's kind of, we get to that through understanding these conversations and the connections and kind of what the beauty of those connections are and the value. I think that the value is something, again, that, what is the value in the innovation of the innovation that comes from those conversations as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, team. I'm so grateful for that brilliant conversation. We have a couple more minutes, and there are some questions from people in the audience. I'm not sure that we will have the time to answer all these questions, but if I could just ask our panelists if you could be so kind to perhaps go through the comments later on to fill in any gaps that there may be. But the first question is from Fiona Rourke, who says, I love the idea of asking everyone for intentions. Do you think that as creative people and institutions, we carry a particular responsibility to create alternative narratives for the future? And how can we create meaningful movement? So if I could just put that out there to the panel, if anyone wants to take that on.
Well, I think Sam, you should go first.
So I think we can put that rotation on the back burner now, and we can just leave the floor open to anyone who has any ideas.
It's a sneaky question because it's 3 questions in one.
Yes.
So which is absolutely fine. Gosh, I think everybody who is seen in my book has a responsibility for creating alternative narratives. Everybody who is there. And then also the other question is everybody who cares is probably also responsible, unless they decide not to, which is also perfectly fine, to create alternative narratives. I think there is something about inspiration that is incredibly important around narratives. And for me, the other part, which is actually really interesting as creative people and institutions, it is to present actions on the back of that. What does that look like? Because I think there's an awful lot of narratives out there, but translating those narratives into things, actions, creations is where it becomes very, very rich.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. Anyone else have something they want to add to that?
I just want to tackle the third part of that question around creating meaningful movement. I think a huge part of that is actually having that conversation out loud. Because as we said, responsible innovation can mean so many things to so many people, and people use different language to tackle that. And actually creating spaces for that sense making and creating spaces for working through what that means in a public way and in a collaborative way is a really important part of creating movement, because some of it gets lost in some of the inertia and some of the internal conversations or the internal spaces that we exist within. It becomes very hard to point to clear cases of movement across the board, and to then use that to galvanize momentum or create hope for people who are looking to create change.
Thank you so much, Sam. Will, did you have anything that you wanted to add? Are we okay to move on to the next question?
I do, but I think it'll take too long for me to
That's
articulate
fine.
it in my head. But it's just on the kind of point of kind of the creative, the institutions sort of carrying a particular responsibility. I think in terms of a movement forwards, kind of playing into what Sam was saying, I think if anyone's expected or feels like they have a responsibility to carry that load, then I think that's going to hinder a movement. But I think that is currently kind of the situation. And I think if we look at specifically the climate crisis and how that movement needs to move forwards, I think from my own experience, I worked often with my background is in science, it's geology, but that sort of pushed me into science engagement. And we've only really seen in the last 5 years cultural organizations sort of starting to respond to the climate crisis with the action they're taking. And it always felt like this very kind of didactic's maybe not the right word, but there was always kind of very much these two camps, and kind of science engagement had been trying to talk about climate change for ages, and arts have been trying to do it for ages, and it was because of this kind of competition. And I think also because they felt like there was a certain responsibility on one party to move that forwards, that it kind of hindered it. So just to kind of add to what both Alex and Sam were saying in terms of, I think it's something for everyone that needs to think about this in order to kind of create that meaningful movement. And it's not one responsibility of one kind of the cultural sector or the scientific sector or anything like that.
Thank you so much. So because of time, I think we're going to have to stop, but I will read out questions that we received from John and Anna. So John has asked, what examples do you have for responsible tech working at scales that are sustainable? And Anna asks, is responsible innovation about leaving more open ends, not setting too tight controls or intentions? So what I would ask our panelists to do is if you could just perhaps answer, give any answers that you have through the chat function on Hopin. And those who ask the questions, please keep an eye out for that. But with that being said, I'm going to say thank you so much for participating in this panel. I really look forward to us continuing to work together on our working group. So this is not a one-time event at all. This is an ongoing conversation. And if you who are watching have any ideas or any kind of provocations for us, please feel free to reach out to us. We will be very grateful for those, because we want to keep improving. And we realize, like I said in the beginning, that we do not have all the answers. So with that being said, I'm going to remind you all that we have one more session to go on the main stage, which is going to be hosted by Watershed's very own executive producer, Joanna Lansdowne. It's going to be a fantastic session looking at the future of collaboration. So please don't leave us just yet. Thank you very much to David and Sarah and to our other BSL interpreters that have been so kindly helping us throughout the day, and wishing you all a fantastic and restful afternoon and weekend. Bye, everyone.